Before the sun lifted its pale face over the roofs of London, the iron was already biting into William Wallace's flesh. The chains rattled softly in the damp, early mist as guards hauled him. From the tower, the stone walls around him cold, indifferent, ancient watchers of countless deaths. They called him traitor as they dragged him through the mud, though in his silence, in the set of his shoulders, there was a deeper truth that no English decree could erase. But they came, all of them, drawn from their hovels and shops, children lifted onto shoulders, women clutching shawls over their mouths, men with arms folded, trying to look unafraid as they watched him pass. Yet in the hush that followed the cart's slow journey, you could almost hear the heartbeat of the crowd, faster now, terrified, alive. Somewhere, a dog barked, sharp against the morning silence, before being silenced by its owner's boot. But the people leaned closer, pressing forward, unable to look away, pulled by the slow horror of a man being led to slaughter. His name had already become a whisper of defiance in the alehouses and farmsteads, a name mothers muttered over the heads of their sleeping children, a name that frightened the English crown. Because it had learned to walk on the tongues of the poor, they said nothing, for there was nothing to say in the presence of a man being led to die. It is said that Wallace's hair was tangled with the filth of his cell, the scent of damp straw and blood clinging to him like a second skin. His feet, shackled and raw, left faint red tracks in the mud as the cart wheels creaked, each turn pulling him closer to Smithfield, where the scaffold waited like a hungry mouth. A soft fog rolled across the waking city, hiding the narrow alleys where beggars huddled and thieves whispered over stolen bread. The air was thick with the stench of tallow and dung, and the faint smoke of hearth fires from London homes that would forget him tomorrow. They say he did not weep nor did he curse, but in his gaze there was something like a prayer not for himself, but for a land of heather, and cold streams for forests that once hid him. As he fled for hills that had echoed with the sound of hoofbeats, as Scotland's sons rode behind him, Wallace's eyes, hollowed from months of chains and starvation, lifted to the sky, cloud-heavy and pale, as if to measure how much longer it would be before the world would know light again. They crossed the city gates, the guards shouting at the people to clear the way. But the people leaned closer, pressing forward, unable to look away, pulled by the slow horror of a man being led to slaughter. His name had already become a whisper of defiance in the alehouses and farmsteads, a name mothers muttered over the heads of their sleeping children. A dark smear of blood trailed down his neck, seeping into the linen that hung from his bones. A woman reached out from the crowd, holding a small wooden cross, whispering words that were lost under the sound of hooves and iron. A guard struck her hand away, but Wallace's eyes caught hers for a moment, and it is said that he nodded barely as if to thank her for remembering that a man's soul might still matter even when the body was condemned. The silence felt endless, like the air itself had frozen, waiting for the first scream, the first cut, the first proof that the crown could crush any man who dared to defy it. Breathing in the dawn, one last time, before the guards dragged him to the waiting scaffold where horror had already begun to sharpen its knives. He gritted his teeth, though his body was weak, and the guards exchanged glances. For in that moment, in that grimace of pain, there was no surrender, only the glint of a man who knew death had followed him all his life and would not frighten him. Now, the dew on the grass glinted like glass shards, and the scaffold rose from the earth. Black against the grey dawn, ropes swaying gently in the breeze. Waiting, the crowd thickened, pressing forward, the air tight with breath and fear, a mass of eyes that could not turn away, drawn by the grim promise of the king's justice, a name that frightened the English crown because it had learned to walk on the tongues of the poor. The car jerked suddenly as it struck a rut, and Wallace's head snapped back, the iron collar biting deep. They passed under the shadow of St. Bartholomew's, the bells tolling. Slow and heavy, each peal a reminder that the scaffold was near. The sun began to break through the clouds as they reached Smithfield. The cart halted. The guards climbed down, pulling at Wallace's chains, yanking him forward so he fell to his knees in the mud. The weight of the chains made it difficult to stand, but still he tried, rising slowly, shaking, covered in grime, his face turned toward the scaffold. They say the crowd fell silent as he stood there, framed by the rising sun, a thin, battered man who had once rallied the clans, who had made England tremble, who now was alone in the final hour. And in that hush, as birds circled overhead and the ropes creaked softly, William Wallace closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the dawn one last time, before the guards dragged him to the waiting scaffold where horror had already begun to sharpen its knives. They pressed so close that morning that the air itself seemed to collapse between bodies, a suffocating crush of wool and unwashed skin, the dampness of breath and fear mingling above the churned mud of Smithfield. It was a silence that was not truly silent, the cough of an old man, a child whimpering into her mother's skirts, the restless shifting of feet in the sludge. But beneath these small sounds was a hush so profound that it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The people had come for many reasons. Some came to see a traitor die, eager for the grim spectacle, the promise of blood to break the monotony of hunger and labor. His chains clanked in the morning chill, the soft, wet sounds of his feet in the mud the only measure of time as he passed them by, tears welling in his eyes. For even a child could sense the heavy dread rising from the boards of that scaffold, that his eyes, sunken but alive, passed over them and left something behind in their hearts, a small flame of shame or courage that would not go out easily. He did not look at them, but some say he felt the weight of every gaze, each one pressing into him like a question that could not be asked out loud. Others came because they were told to come, because absence might draw questions from the wrong men. And some came in quiet defiance, their eyes shadowed beneath rough hoods, men and women, whose families had come from the north. Men with iron masks, the executioners, stood ready, their hands steady, faces hidden from the judgment of the living. They tore the remnants of linen from his bruised, starved body, exposing flesh so pale it looked like the belly of a dead fish in the dawn light. And the people watched some turning their faces away, but unable to close their ears, to the sound of iron scraping wood, the shuffle of feet, the creak of rope as it was tested by men who had tied too many knots. They had performed this ritual before, but there was a stiffness in their posture, as if they'd felt the breath of something ancient moving through the crowd, reminding them that some deaths leave a stain deeper than blood. Whose hearts still beat for the cold wind over heather whose kin had whispered of Wallace. In the glow of dying hearth embers, it is said that as Wallace was led to the scaffold, the crowd parted with the strange reverence reserved for those who were already half in the grave. Why him? Why now? Why must hope die in the mud before dawn? The platform stood dark and heavy against the pale sky, the ropes dangling like question marks over the future of a land they would never see. Wallace was lifted, dragged, thrown onto the scaffold's boards. A child asked his father, in a voice too loud, "What will they do to him?" And the father hushed him so violently that the boy stumbled. Although historians are divided, one version says that Wallace looked over the sea of faces and saw not enemies, but a people forced to watch their own fear made manifest, that his eyes, sunken but alive, passed over them and left something behind in their hearts, a small flame of shame or courage. That would not go out easily. The priests came, chanting their prayers, and some in the crowd murmured along, crossing themselves, whispering pleas for their own souls rather than for the man bound before them. The words mixed with the cries of crows overhead, their black wings slicing the sky, restless. Knowing the feast that would come before noon, the executioners stepped back, waiting for the signal, the world frozen in that single, terrible breath between life and death. They tied him down on the frame, and the sound of rope pulling tight was louder than the wind, louder than the shifting feet of the watchers, louder even than the beating of terrified hearts. And trembling, each person wrapped in the quiet horror of witnessing a death that was more than a death. This was not the quiet of respect nor the hush of reverence, but the quiet of a people forced to look upon the body of defiance, to see how the crown would break it piece by piece, until all that remained was a warning nailed into the minds of the living. And in that moment, the silence of the crowd was a living thing, thick. Some closed their eyes, unable to watch as the knives were drawn, but they could still hear. And the crowd, binding them all together in that cold, grey dawn. Others kept their eyes open wide, unblinking, determined to witness every moment so that they could carry it back to their homes, whisper it over their tables, pass it on like a dark blessing, like a promise that what they saw would not be forgotten. The first screams would come soon, but for now, the silence reigned, deeper than prayer, heavier than chains. A silence that wrapped around Wallace, a silence that knew it was the last mercy the world would grant before the knives began their work. The rope scratched against his skin as they pulled him tighter. Arms and legs spread on the frame of execution, the dawn wind tracing lines of cold along the exposed flesh of a man, already claimed by death. The scaffold groaned softly under the shifting weight, a low, uneasy sigh that seemed to echo beneath the hush of the grey London sky. The ritual began, not with a shout, but with a gesture from the executioner's gloved hand, a quiet signal that would usher in a storm of screams. They stripped him fully, the last rags torn away, leaving Wallace naked before the hundreds of eyes pressed close, the mud beneath the scaffold, black and slick from rain and the stains of older executions. His body was marked with bruises, lashes healed in dark ridges, wounds poorly mended. testament to the months of chains that had led to this dawn. The executioners worked with the calm of craftsmen. Blades honed and knives passed between them with the quiet familiarity of men. Who had done this before? Who understood that the ritual was not about death, but about the breaking of spirit, the obliteration of defiance in front of the living? Not a cry for mercy, but the instinctive sound of a man fighting to remain alive, even as the life was being pulled from him. In the quiet whimpers of those who could not bear to watch, but could not bear to leave. This was the king's justice, and it demanded witnesses. His head turned, hair plastered to his sweat-drenched face, eyes unfocused, seeing perhaps the hills of Scotland in that moment, the coal streams where he had once washed the blood from his sword, the green of the forests where he had hidden from the hunters sent to bring him to this place. It is said that the first blade was not meant to kill, but to test the living limits of flesh. A shallow cut, along the belly, deliberate and slow, enough to make the breath catch in his throat, enough to draw a gasp that bled into the air. The crowd shifted, a ripple of nausea and dread, as the blood welled up and ran in thin streams over his skin, dripping from the edge of the wooden frame into the dirt. And something deeper, something foul that turned the faces of those who watched. Some covered their mouths, retching into their hands, but their eyes could not look away, pulled to the sight of the entrails drawn out, long ropes of glistening red, held up like trophies to the crowd. There was no scream at first, only the grinding of teeth, the tightening of every muscle in a body that knew it was being unmade. They opened the belly, careful, precise, the steam of torn flesh rising in the morning air. The scent of iron, according to some accounts. Wallace groaned, then a low guttural sound that seemed to shake the boards of the scaffold. The priests chanted softly, their voices weaving a thin veil of prayer over the horror, but the words were drowned in the wet sounds of flesh parting under the knives. In the quiet whimpers of those who could not bear to watch, but could not bear to leave. This was the king's justice, and it demanded witnesses. The executioners moved with the deliberation of men who were part of a sacred duty, though there was nothing holy in the way the knives moved, in the way the flesh quivered and tore. The ritual required patience, a slow descent into death that would send fear crawling into every village, every home that might think of rebellion, and piercing, as if he had returned from the haze of agony to look at the faces pressed close to the scaffold, a gaze that did not plead, did not curse, but simply looked, forcing those who watched to meet the eyes of the man they were killing, to share for an instant in the unbearable weight of that dawn. The blades would move again, deeper this time, seeking the organs with brutal care, pulling them free, displaying them to the silent crowd. A dark theater meant to teach the lesson of obedience. The heart would come later. The head would come later. But now, the ritual had begun, and the dawn at Smithfield was no longer quiet, filled instead with the soft, wet sounds of a body being undone before the eyes of a trembling people. It is said that Wallace's eyes opened fully then, just for a moment, clear. His breathing was ragged, shallow, each gasp a small, desperate pull against the ropes that held him fast. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the boards, dripping into the mud that would remain stained long after the crows had picked the bones clean. lost under the cries of the crowd a word that might have been the name of his country, a word that might have been a prayer, or perhaps it was nothing, just the last breath of a man who refused to scream as the ritual of dismemberment began in earnest. The executioners paused only to wipe their blades, the bright steel catching the thin light of the morning, the red streaks on their gloves like ribbons of warning. Although not officially recorded, many believe that as the entrails were pulled from his body, Wallace managed a single word. The ritual was not yet finished, and over it all, the crows circled, black against the pale morning, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when the ritual would end and the silence would return. The morning had grown brighter, but the light was pale, cold, unfeeling as it fell on the scaffold where William Wallace's blood pooled in dark halos. Around the wood, the crowd was quieter now, their initial gasps and murmurs choked into silence, eyes glazed with shock, the scent of iron thick in every breath they took. Yet the ritual was not finished, for the law demanded more than blood. It demanded the heart itself. His eyes flickered open, then closed, then open again. A war against the darkness pulling him under. The priests were still chanting, but their voices were thin, fearful, words caught in their throats as they watched the ritual they were meant to sanctify become something monstrous. Each breath was a rebellion, each heartbeat a defiance, as if he would deny death as long as he could, even as the executioners prepared the final, most terrible part of their work. They reached into the ruin of his body, fingers slick with blood, seeking the trembling life still, hidden within the wreckage of ribs and torn flesh. There was a moment of stillness, as if the world itself paused to watch, to witness, to remember. They had seen him opened, watched as the ropes of flesh were pulled from him, watched as his body convulsed, pinned by the ropes, unable to curl into the agony tearing through him. That left the watchers shaking, the memory of it seared into them deeper than any blade could cut. It was the scream of a man whose life was being torn from him while he still lived. The final defiance forced into sound, the agony of flesh and spirit meeting at a single, terrible point, and he saw the sky above him, grey and endless, the crows circling, the pale light of dawn, sharpening the edges of clouds. Perhaps in that instant he saw the hills of Scotland again, the dark line of the forest where freedom had lived for a breath of time, the cold streams where he had washed his wounds, the heather that once bent beneath the wind, whispering of a land not yet conquered. It is said that Wallace's breaths came in shudders, a ragged, bubbling wheeze as he lay half-conscious on the frame, the cold air tightening the drying blood on his skin into blackened streaks. A hush fell across the gathered mass, so deep that the creak of the scaffold under the shifting weight of the executioners was as loud as thunder. The executioners moved in close, their hands sure, their blades ready, according to some accounts. Wallace's eyes opened then, fully, clear for a moment. Perhaps he saw the faces of those he had led, those who had believed in him, those who still might, even now. And then the hand closed around his heart. They say the scream that came from him was like nothing the crowd had ever heard, a sound that tore the thin veil of mourning apart, that left the watchers shaking, the memory of it seared into them deeper than any blade could cut. It was the scream of a man whose life was being torn from him while he still lived. The final defiance forced into sound, the agony of flesh and spirit meeting at a single, terrible point. The executioner's arm lifted, the heart held high, dripping, steaming in the cold air. The blood falling in fat drops onto the boards. The heart and the eyes saw each other, the final tether between spirit and body stretched thin, before snapping into the darkness, onto the boots of the men who killed him, onto the mud where it would mix with the filth of the city. Some in the crowd turned away, weeping, unable to watch, unable to leave, trapped by the gravity of the horror unfolding before them. But in the hush that followed, in the pale dawn light, there was a sense that something deeper had been witnessed, that this ritual had failed to erase what it sought to destroy. Although not officially recorded, many believe that as the heart was lifted, Wallace's eyes were still open, that for an instant, the moment, the ritual claimed the life of William Wallace. In the most brutal, intimate act of violence a king could command, the executioners displayed the heart to the crowd, shouting that this was the traitor's heart, the heart of a man who dared to defy the king, a heart that beat for rebellion and freedom. Now silenced forever, the body on the frame still now slack empty, waiting for the final desecration that would scatter it across the roads as a warning. For the people saw not the heart of a traitor, but the heart of a man who had fought for what he believed in, a man who had defied the greatest power in the land, a man whose scream would echo in the bones of every witness for as long as they lived. The heart was thrown into the fire, the flames crackling, hissing as the blood struck the embers, a final offering to the ritual, smoke rising in thin, dark coils into the morning sky, drifting over the rooftops of London, over the river, over the land that would remember. The scaffold creaked again. As the executioners stepped back, their hands read, their faces hidden behind masks. The ritual complete in its cruelty, the people remained silent, the image of the torn heart burned into their minds, unable to forget the sight, the scream. And above them, the crows still circled, waiting, patient, black wings against a grey sky. The watchers of death who would carry the whispers of that dawn to every corner of the land. The dawn that witnessed William Wallace's final scream had passed, leaving behind a grey morning heavy with the stink of blood and ash, the scaffold dark and wet, the boards groaning under the slack weight of what remained. The executioners worked with the quiet precision of butchers, their knives, moving through muscle and sinew, separating bone from bone, cleaving the limbs as the crowd watched in stunned silence. The morning wind carrying the metallic scent over the packed earth of Smithfield. But the ritual was not yet done, for the law demanded more than the tearing of flesh and the burning of a heart. The law demanded scattering, demanded the breaking of the body so completely that no grave could hold it, so completely that no legend could grow around it. They cut him down from the frame, the rope stiff with dried blood, the body a ruin of torn flesh and hollow places where life had been stolen. They would travel far, these pieces of Wallace, carried by horse and cart, through the winding roads of England, to be nailed upon the gates of Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, each piece a silent sentinel of the king's warning. It is said that the sound of the limbs being hacked away was quiet, almost gentle, the blades striking the joints, the crack of bone like twigs snapping beneath a boot. The body did not move. The eyes no longer saw. but the watchers flinched with each blow, as if each cut was striking them as well, teaching them the shape of the king's justice. The head, severed with a final stroke, was held up by the hair, the face pale, the mouth slightly open as if whispering to the cold wind that moved through the crowd. When it was done, the four quarters were laid out upon the boards, pale and bloodless, the steam of torn flesh rising into the morning air. According to some accounts, there was a moment then when the crowd stepped back, a ripple of fear and reverence moving through them as if they knew they were in the presence of something larger than the king's decree, something older, something that would not be forgotten no matter how many roads the limbs would travel. They dipped the head in tar, black and shining, sealing the flesh to preserve the grim trophy for its final display. The eyes were closed, or perhaps they were left open, to watch forever over the city that had killed him. It is said the head was heavy in the executioner's hand, as if the spirit of Wallace had refused to leave, lingering in the flesh, waiting for the wind to carry his name north. The limbs were wrapped in cloth, each wrapped carefully, not out of respect, but to keep the flesh intact long enough to serve its final purpose. They would travel far, these pieces of Wallace, carried by horse and cart, through the winding roads of England, to be nailed upon the gates of Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, each piece a silent sentinel of the king's warning. The roads were long, winding through green fields and dark forests, over rivers and under the heavy grey sky of a land that would remember. Each village the carts passed through fell silent as the people realized what they carried, the smell of tar and death thick around them, the blood still seeping through the wrappings, to drip upon the dirt roads, marking a dark trail through the heart of England and into the north. When the limbs arrived, they were nailed high upon the gates, above the roads where merchants and farmers passed, where children were led by their mothers, where the wind carried the scent of decay into the fields. Dark altars where the people were reminded not of the king's power and the keepers of memory, carrying the name of Wallace north upon the wind, but of the cost of freedom and the shape of a man who dared to pay that price. The flesh blackened in the sun, rotted under the rain, the crows coming to pull at the tatters, their cries echoing over the stone walls, the bones shining pale in the moonlight, but grew in the silence of those who passed beneath his flesh. That children who saw the blackened limbs would remember that men who rode past would tell the story in low voices by the fire, that the scattered pieces of his body became seeds of defiance planted upon the roads of a land that could not forget, and all who passed beneath them would look up, some crossing themselves, some spitting to ward off the fear that crept into their hearts, some whispering prayers, others whispering his name. The boats passed beneath, the oars dipping into the grey water, and those who looked up saw the head of Wallace, and in their hearts something stirred, a whisper that did not die, for the king believed this would end the memory of Wallace, that these quartered limbs would silence the songs, the stories, the hope that had grown in the cold hills of Scotland. But it is said that as the crows feasted and the limbs rotted, the name of William Wallace did not fade. The head, placed upon a spike on London Bridge, watched over the river as the tides moved beneath it, the tar glistening, the eyes empty, yet seeing everything. For though the ritual had scattered him, had broken him, had sought to erase him from the living world. The roads that carried his limbs and the gates that bore them became shrines of a different kind, and above it all, the crows circled, black wings against the dawn. The witnesses of death and the keepers of memory, carrying the name of Wallace north upon the wind. They thought it ended there, in the slow black rot of flesh on spikes, in the tarred heads staring blindly over the Thames, in the crows tearing ribbons from limbs nailed to distant gates. They believed that death could be final if it was brutal enough that fear would bind the mouths of those who still remembered him, that the damp wind of Scotland would carry only silence after William Wallace's scream was lost to the dawn. But the roads did not forget. They told tales in the hush of night of a ghost that walked the roads, where the limbs had been carried a tall figure with a torn banner fluttering at its back, a pale fire in its eyes striding north under the moonlight. The limbs, stiff and darkened by sun and rain, swayed above the gates as the seasons turned, and that he spoke a single word before fading into the dark. She would not say what that word was, only that she woke with tears on her cheeks, her heart filled with a strange, unshakable hope. A flicker of movement among the bare branches, the soft clink of ghostly iron, a breath of wind that smelled of heather and smoke. But each time a village fell silent as soldiers marched through. Each time the wind sighed over the charred remains of a croft, the whisper followed them, and though they would tell themselves it was only fog, only fear, only the whispering trees, they would quicken their steps, clutching their cloaks tighter, unable to shake the feeling that something was walking beside them, silent, unseen. Snow gathered on the blackened bone, melting into droplets that fell upon the stone and mud below, as if the body still wept quietly in the cold. Farmers leading carts beneath the limbs would bow their heads, not in obedience, but in a silent, hidden reverence, a prayer without words spoken in the hush before dawn. Children whispered stories to each other as they passed the gates, daring each other to look up, to meet the eyeless stare of the dead. It is said that on cold nights, when the fog lay thick upon the roads, travellers would see him standing at the edges of the forest, half hidden in mist, watching. They buried what they could. In secret places, a finger bone found beneath the gate, a splinter of rib prized from a spike, scraps of cloth clinging to weathered rope. These fragments were hidden beneath stones on the hills, buried in churchyards under the cover of darkness, or cast into the cold rivers. Small rituals of remembrance, quiet acts of defiance. According to some accounts, a woman in Perth once claimed that Wallace came to her in a dream, standing at the foot of her bed, his face pale, but his eyes bright. The English crown sent more soldiers north, hammering down uprisings, burning villages, demanding oaths of loyalty. Wallace, although historians are divided, one version says that Robert the Bruce himself, when he took up the fight, carried in his mind the image of Wallace torn apart, but unbroken in spirit the memory of that quiet dawn when the world had tried to kill a man so completely that not even a grave would hold him, and in the forests where rebels gathered in the cold, around small fires that threw shadows against the trunks, they spoke his name, not as a martyr, but as a promise. Waiting by the stone walls, where moss grew thick, pausing in the quiet dawn to watch the mists rise from the glens, The limbs rotted, the bones fell, the crows flew, and the wind carried the name of Wallace. Through the heather, over the lochs, through the forests, where the deer still walked over the villages, where children grew up hearing stories of the man who would not bow. They told how he had fought, how he had bled, how he had died with his heart torn from him, but with his spirit unbent. They spoke of the limbs scattered on the roads not as warnings, but as seeds, planted in the mud and the blood, from which freedom might one day grow. They say the ghost of William Wallace walked north not in chains, but tall and silent, watching over the rivers and hills. And in that endless quiet, long after the scaffold had been cleaned, long after the limbs had become bone, long after the crows had flown, the ghost that walked north remained, watching, waiting, whispering of a freedom that could not be killed, no matter how many pieces they tried to cut it into.